Hello, welcome back. It's Roger Royce, host of the 10,000 Startups podcast. I'm a partner with Haynes Boone in Palo Alto, California. I do emerging growth and venture capital. And today we're going to talk about cybersecurity. What happens if you have a breach, a data breach? What do you do? Where do you go? When do you have to do it? And what can you do to prepare for this? I can tell you, having been there myself many years ago, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare to have that dumped on you at the worst possible time without having a plan in place and without really knowing immediately what has to be done. So today, fortunately, we have somebody here who's going to explain all that to us. Brent Owen is a partner in a litigation practice group in Haynes Boone's Denver office. His practice focuses on high stakes trial work in both state and federal courts before judges and juries and arbitration. His litigation practice emphasizes energy, complex commercial disputes, construction disputes, environmental claims, and of course, data breach litigation. He's an experienced first-year trial lawyer. So, Brent, thanks for being here today with us to talk about data breach litigation, I guess we'll call it.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. Happy to be here.
So let me kind of just jump right into it. Like I say, having been there, suppose you walk into in my case, I was sitting on a panel for the American Bar Association discussing a 2 hour panel discussing, of all things, the duty of technological competence among lawyers. And I was completely out of the market for 2 hours. And after my 2 hour panel, I picked up my phone and I had hundreds of email messages on it that came in over the 2 hours because I'd had a breach. And then the next 24 hours were just a nightmare of figuring that out and unwinding it. So what happens for our startup entrepreneur who walks into their office one morning, they turn on their computer and they find out that something is really, really wrong? What do they do?
I think the very first step is truly to call a lawyer who's an expert because it's going to be a situation where you need somebody to kind of get their arms around the whole situation and manage the situation from a holistic perspective. Because as you're saying, you're running around, you've got potentially 100 different problems, and I know we're going to talk about some of the specifics, but you want somebody who's going to look at it holistically, and you want somebody who's going to think about both the immediate problem, right? Either maybe your servers are locked, maybe there's a threat that they're going to release a bunch of private data onto the internet, whatever the immediate problem is. But you need to make sure you're not solving the immediate problem at the expense of significant exposure down the road or breaches with government authorities or in a way that doesn't allow you to recover from insurance, in 3 months when the things have calmed down. So a person who is familiar with it, for whom this isn't just the very first time this has happened, and while that person will treat it as an emergency, they're going to be able to step back and look at it a little bit more holistically and kind of thoughtfully. The other benefit to engaging counsel kind of right away is you're going to be able to protect the investigation to some extent, but with attorney-client privilege or work product, so that kind of the follow-on effects, maybe not every single thing that you discover or all the roads you go down will be discoverable in potential litigation. Say a class action lawsuit follows. You don't want sort of that initial panic to just be out there in the open for some lawyer who's going to try and put you in sort of the worst light possible. You want to have the ability and confidence to be able to discuss the problem in a way that's most productive, and that is what the privilege is for. So that's the immediate first step that I'd recommend.
Yeah, I'll bet that privilege is important because who knows, maybe the company did something wrong that allowed this to happen. And we just don't know, do we?
Yeah, and even if you didn't do anything wrong, frankly, the communications that can happen in the context of an investigation and a crisis can be put into a light that makes it look like you did something wrong. And so it's you don't want to be restricted in how you communicate or talk about a problem because you're worried about the ramifications in subsequent litigation or what a government bureaucrat's going to look at it 3 months down the road and say. You want to be able to solve the problem productively, and that's where getting counsel involved is going to help you have that holistic conversation that isn't going to come back to bite you.
Gotcha. So tell me about the reporting requirements, because that was a big piece of this. As I recall, state of California in particular had very tight timelines on when you had to notify people that their data has been breached?
Yes, there are incredibly tight windows. It varies by jurisdiction, sometimes as short as a month or even potentially tighter depending on the information. And that's again where having expertise that's going to come in and say, here are the jurisdictions where we're worried about. And that is sort of worldwide. I think it's important to note that you're not just thinking about if you have customer information in Europe, they have a whole other set of data that of laws and regulations that are going to govern those reporting requirements. And so the best you can have a breach that you sort of otherwise manage really well, but you get in big trouble because you haven't actually done the reporting requirements that are out there. And so now a kind of what could have been maybe a blip of a problem snowballs into a much bigger problem because you don't comply with the reporting requirements. For instance, in Colorado, you're looking at typically a 30-day. Sometimes you'll have a safe harbor 90 days, 120 days, but it's quick. And frankly, even if the technical reporting requirement gives you more time, say it gives you 3 months, the best way to do it is to get your arms around the situation, understand your problem, get on top of fixing it, and report it proactively. You don't really want to be in a situation where you're actually waiting up to the deadline to report it necessarily. Or if you are doing that, you want to make sure that was deliberate, not because you didn't know.
And that reporting, is that reporting to the people whose data might have been breached, or is that reporting to the governmental agencies, or both?
It can be both. Yeah, it can be both. Sometimes it's done in a two-step process where you're reporting to the agency and then there's coordinated reporting to the people who've breached, whose data has allegedly been compromised.
Okay, gotcha. And then, so the second thing that we wanted to talk about was just the substantive response. And I think that's what you've been talking a little bit more about. How important is it to get who's the first person someone should call? Let me put it that way, because there's lawyers involved, there's IT people involved, there's insurance people involved. What should a person do?
Yeah, so the person who's manning the response, who in our kind of ideal situation is probably an outside counsel with the expertise. I think the next person that person is going to call is going to be a technical expert. Because the thing about the data breaches is sometimes the hackers who have breached your system, that you know about it at a date certain, they may have been in your system for 6 months. They may have infiltrated in ways you can't understand. They may be lying in wait, and this may just be the very first thing they're going to do. So to be proactive and sort of get in front of the problem, you need the right expertise to investigate and really understand the extent and depth of the infiltration so that you can cut it off, right? If you're just playing whack-a-mole with the problem and they say, okay, we've got this data and we're going to release it on Twitter in 48 hours if you don't pay us, for instance, and all you do is kind of figure out in the short term how to solve that problem, either pay them or prevent them from releasing the information, you haven't really, all you've done is encourage them to kind of dig back in and find something else to attack you with. So the best offense in this situation is to really understand the problem from a technical perspective as quickly as possible. And there are forensic experts that, if you have somebody managing this situation, should know who to hire. So that would be who the call is to. You asked, and then I can go sequentially, but I don't want to just ramble. So
No, why don't we go? So who's the next person?
so then I think you have that figured out. I think the next thing to do is to look at your insurance policies, right? So you probably will have some general commercial insurance out there. You might have specific cyber insurance, and what you need to do, those policies, much like the reporting to government agencies, much like the reporting potentially to individuals, those policies are going to have incredibly quick timelines to report the issue. And so you want to make sure the insurance company is on notice of this problem. And the insurance company then in turn will potentially have class counsel. And let me back up and talk about what that means. The insurance company has a set arrangement with attorneys where those attorneys have kind of a rate that they've negotiated with the insurance company to provide this kind of expertise. And if you provide notice to the insurance company quickly, they can engage that counsel who can either work with your first line attorney you called, or can even take it over if that's makes the most sense, and can in the most cost-effective way kind of start managing that problem. So the insurance company needs to know so that they can help you effectively sort of navigate what the next steps are, and including if there's a ransom to be paid. But really, the first part that they're going to do is try and engage outside counsel as well to navigate the situation in many of the ways we've already sort of discussed.
Right. Yeah, in my experience, the insurance company even had their own technical people. To kind of look over the shoulder of my technical people and make sure, because they've been through this 100 times and they kind of knew where to look and what stone to lift and that kind of thing to find these
Yeah,
state.
which is certainly that's critical. And the other thing is you're going to want, if you're looking down the road 6 months and 12 months, that early engagement with the insurance company is going to prevent them from coming back and sort of second guessing the approach you took, right, as a basis for potentially denying or limiting the claims. You want them with a seat at the table so that if there is exposure for your company, you have pockets there that you can potentially rely on to pay off whatever harm comes. And I think on that note, it's important to make sure you're triggering all the policies, right? Insurance policies can be written vague. They can you can have arguments that certain policies are triggered, even though maybe they aren't. It isn't quite explicit. Like you don't necessarily have a cyber security policy, but you have a general commercial liability policy. Maybe there's language under that policy that you're going to be able to get this into. Try early because that's going to really help your company stem the losses from this data breach. It's going to help at least find ways to offset it. And sometimes insurance companies, if it's gray, right, you have a seat at the table where maybe they're going to pay out a claim. And the earlier you get them involved, the sooner you'll know if you have that available and the extent to which you're going to be able to rely on that.
Yeah, in this day and age, do you think it's advisable for everybody to have cyber insurance?
Yes, I would highly recommend that.
Okay. Yeah, that's for sure. Um, so, and then just kind of drawing on my own experience from about 10 years ago, um, everybody expects that these things are launched from foreign countries and there's nothing you can do about it. I had my IT people do a little investigating, and believe it or not, the attack on my old firm was launched from Los Angeles.
Oh,
We tracked down exactly the person that did it. Let me tell you, as bad a day as it was for me when they hit, it was a worse day for him when we sued him. So tell me about litigation. What are the litigation solutions here that a person might have?
yeah, and there's computer fraud and abuse acts in most states. There's a federal one, and then there's also usually state law equivalent. So if you are in a situation where the attacker is someone you can prosecute in the United States or even in, say, essentially any Western European country, probably you could consider at least running it down. But let's kind of stick to the United States because that's the strongest. Then you should this isn't the immediate step, right? You're not immediately turning to see who you should sue, but say you've done the things we talked about before and you're going to go on the offensive. Once you have that investigation, you can certainly come and look to them to try and recover. One thing to flag as you're kind of weighing the costs and benefits, if this person is just, say, a lone hacker, like if there isn't actually money there to be had from them, you're going to want to weigh the cost benefits of actually prosecuting that person, right? Because you get a very eye-popping judgment and have absolutely no ability to collect. Now you've spent a lot of money on attorneys, sort of morally vindicating your rights, but at the end of the day, you haven't actually helped your business because you just have a piece of paper. But assuming that person is also solvent in a way that you could recover, then that is certainly an angle. The flip side on the litigation front is the threat of class actions or even individual actions by consumers whose data has been exposed. And then I know we're sort of focused on not public companies, but then there's just a flag. There's in the follow-up, which is a securities claim based on the privacy breach, based on the non-disclosure of the privacy breach. But let's pivot to if you're at a startup and you could potentially face a class action for all of the folks whose information has been released, right? And they're gonna assert damages based on either state law statutory claims or even common law invasion of privacy claims. And those can be very tricky to litigate and negotiate to a resolution because you're dealing with a mass of people. So even if their damages are, say, just a statutory fine, say $250 for this information being out there, Well, if it's thousands and thousands of people, the numbers that you're talking about are enormous to pay off the claim. And sort of to boot, there's not like a great defense. If you know if the information has been compromised, you really kind of are facing liability. In that instance, it's important to sort of analyze your risk clear-eyed, not just, boy, I wish we didn't have this lawsuit. I really don't want to pay him, but instead sit down and kind of in sober evaluation of your actual exposure and see what you can do to negotiate a resolution quickly before you're paying a lot of attorney's fees to litigate the case.
Yeah, that could add up. Will insurance typically cover these statutory penalties or damages?
It's Yeah, so kind of two buckets. Oftentimes, the penalties themselves will be carved out. Like an insurance policy might say, because you can characterize those penalties. They might fit closer to like a deliberate misconduct bucket. Sometimes the insurance companies won't pay those. A good cybersecurity policy, on the other hand, should get the bigger risk, the non-government fines, but the side where you're talking about um, consumer damages, class actions, a good cybersecurity policy should cover both the cyber security, like the damages from the individual consumers, and potentially pay for the defense, because the defense of the big class action cases can sometimes match or exceed the cost that you're actually going to have to pay at the end of the day. And that's actually a really good kind of juncture to flag on the front end that you should be, don't just sort of buy a cyber security policy, right? Buy one that's going to protect you from the real risks. And it might be that you need to talk to either a broker or lawyer or both and make sure that the policy that you're getting is going to cover the real risks that you face. Because it can be easy in this situation to deal with abstractions so that your policy isn't covering the things that are actually going to cost you a lot of money.
Gotcha. Okay. Shifting gears a little bit, not I notice that I will oftentimes get these notices that say, oh, we want to inform you there was a data breach on this site that you were on, and it happened like a year ago. And um, and I'm thinking, well, that's because they didn't know about it till then. But I got to believe the temptation might be, given what you just said about the liability potential, there might be a temptation on behalf of a company that has a data breach to just not tell anybody and just hide it and quietly pay the ransom or fix the system or do whatever and not let the world know. Number one, how important is it for somebody to resist that temptation?
Well, I suspect that temptation, it might feel really good briefly when you feel like you've just sort of buried the problem, you paid the ransom, and now you're like, oh, it's gone away. But what you've done is planted a seed that's going to be an enormous problem at some point. You essentially put a landmine in the ground, and you will step on it. It's just a question of when. And when you step on it, you'll have problems with regulators, class action plaintiff attorneys, potentially individual consumers. And now the harm has gone from being, say, a statutory fine where they're or a statutory amount that you know that their data has been released, and so they owe some small amount of money, to potentially real consequential damages because their information was stolen. You didn't let them know about it, and now they suffered some greater harm that is exponentially more. And the regulators too will not look very favorably on people who don't, when you don't comply with the law, you don't get the benefit of the safe harbor provisions. You don't get the benefit of the doubt from anyone down the line. So you're litigating a class action 3 years from when you decided to hide that. You're now on the hook potentially for punitive or exemplary damages because your conduct was malicious. It wasn't just bad. You go from essentially being the victim of a crime to almost being the wrongdoer yourself. And that is never a good spot to be in.
Yeah, and you almost have to assume transparency, don't you? Because, for example, now I've got all sorts of monitoring set up, like Norton and LifeLock and stuff like that. So oftentimes they'll tell me, I'll get a notice and say, look, we found some of your information on the dark web, and this is where it came from. So I think it'd be awfully hard to hide for too long, given how sophisticated the monitoring is.
Well, and complementing that is that, we talked about earlier, you want an investigation on the front end to know the extent of it. So the flip side of hiding it, not just are you facing ramifications down the road, but you're potentially exacerbating your problem by not knowing the extent of your problem because you're kind of just trying to sweep it under the rug. And meanwhile, the hackers, the people who've breached your data, can continue to cause mischief because you aren't being proactive to solve it. So there's even another layer of problems that you're setting for yourself.
Yeah. So maybe the last thing I'll ask you is who is most likely to be a target of this? Because if you think about it, if you're a really large organization, you've probably got pretty robust protections in place. If you're really small, I don't know if it's worth going after, a really small organization. Maybe it is, but who should be most worried about these sorts of attacks?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you make a good point that a lot of the big companies are going to have those protections, right? So there's certainly a target because that's huge upside. But when I think about who kind of comes to mind as the kind of quintessential one, it's like a startup that just went through a very prominent Series A funding. So you know that there's 10 guys or 10 guys and gals who've been working really hard and they got their company going and they're doing 1,000 things, right? But they maybe don't have in-house counsel. They maybe don't have kind of like all the systems in place to really make sure that they're protected against this, both legally and from an IT side. But they do have a lot of cash. That is kind of a ripe target because they're sitting there in this development phase and everything's moving quickly. And maybe this hasn't been a top priority. And the data infiltrator, the hackers can make it a top priority really quick because they can put your system on lockdown and put you at a significant disadvantage. So I would say that's probably the sort of the sweet spot for the ones who face this threat and who maybe aren't as well prepared to defend it right away.
Well, yeah, and plus you got cash, and they know you got cash at that
Yeah,
point.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, anything else that our audience should know about this topic that I
No, I
have?
think this has been super productive. I appreciate you letting me chat with you.
Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks very much. This is Roger Royce, 10,000 Startups. We've been talking with Brent Owen, who is a litigation partner with Haynes Boone in Denver, about what to do in the case of a data breach. So thanks for being here with us today, Brent. We'll sign off now and we'll see you all next week.